I've always believed, had a strong belief, and have been grown up to believe that a balance of life is to the give and to take. And so I was fortunate enough to be raised by my great-grandfather, the late Chief Lawrence Baker. And he always said his teachings in the language was hau'uchskanoch, and to always share and to be generous and to never be stingy. And so the song was composed by Chief Ian Campbell for the Four Host First Nations. So here's Tlasalum Slolum. Ocean. As we refer to it, has been taken care of. I would now like to invite you to participate. You folks look like you want to Indian aerobics. Are you ready? So what I'm going to do, I'm going to split you, seeing as you're in two groups already. You folks, I'm going to ask you to be the spokos, the eagle. And so these are the creatures who send our prayers and our thoughts up to the Creator. And so we're going to, when you hear spokos, that's your cue to stand up and shake your tail feather. Spokos, okay? And over here, you folks, you guys are going to be the yo-yos, the killer whale. And so to dance like a killer whale, simply this movement, and go ahead and when you breach, don't be shy. Okay, just don't splash your partner, okay? So when you hear yo-yos, that's your cue to bust some killer whale moves, okay? The song I'm going to use for this is called Quotas. It's one of the top 10 on our Potlatch hits, also known as Jimmy Jimmy. So here's Quotas. OCM. Yo! thank you for acknowledging the animal kingdom. And now you got bragging rights. You get to go home and tell your friends and family you came to Lighter Living and got to behave like a bunch of wild animals. Thank you for allowing me. Thank you for allowing me to come and share just a glimpse of what our traditional culture looks like. Enjoy the rest of your evening.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. And I'm so glad that Janice, you were here to welcome us to the traditional territories, to invite us to also bring the animal world here into this room, and to share with us that the tradition of living in balance with the earth and also of generosity. So thank you so much. And I'd also welcome all of you from me as well. And I'd like to also introduce Stina Brown, who's on this side. She's a visual facilitator and graphic designer with decades of experience on designing facilitation. So thank you for being here, Stina. She's going to be listening, documenting our words and ideas to create a couple large graphics. And you can chat with Stina throughout the evening. You can take pictures. She can also let you know how to get a hold of her if you want to learn more about her work. So thank you so much, Stina. So it's been our pleasure to co-host this event with One Earth as my organization, and then also with the City of Vancouver, with Vancity, and with SFU's Vancity Office of Community Engagement. So we have this wonderful strategic partnership with Vancity on Lighter Living, and it gives me great pleasure to invite our colleague Emily Pearson to say a few words about the Lighter Living project from her perspective. Emily.
Thank you, everyone. We're so excited about this evening. So my name is Emily Pearson. I'm the Portfolio Manager for Environmental Sustainability in Community Investment at Vancity Credit Union, Canada's largest community credit union. So at Vancity, we are committed to improving the well-being of our members and building healthy communities. Our vision is to redefine wealth and to rethink what that word even means, and to re-envision prosperity as something we can only achieve if we are surrounded by and connected to a vibrant, healthy community that is sustainable for the long term. As a financial cooperative, we leverage financial tools and services to support community organizations, not-for-profit, social enterprises, and businesses that share our values of building a more equitable future with reduced impact on our environment. One of the ways we do this is through investments made possible by our Enviro Fund, which is generated by Vancity's Enviro Visa card. So Vancity puts 5% of our Visa profits into the Enviro Fund, and in 2017, the focus of this fund became solely dedicated to lighter living, supporting partnerships and initiatives that will lead us to lower our footprint and encourage our community to consume less, waste less, live more, and share more. Lighter living is important to our members and our communities because it allows people to spend their hard-earned money on things that really matter: quality, long-lasting goods, experiences over material possessions, better buildings, and healthier and more sustainable forms of transportation. Lighter living means greater access to more sustainable products and the shared use of goods and services. It means having more time for ourselves, our communities, and the natural world. At Vancity, we believe that everyone is doing something in their daily lives right now to live lighter, such as biking or walking instead of driving, minimizing plastic use, repairing things rather than buying, sharing tools with neighbors, eating less meat, and more. So let's celebrate what we're doing to live lighter. Let's challenge ourselves to do more for the sake of ourselves, our children, and our planet. Partnerships with One Earth are critical to advancing lighter living in our communities, and we're fortunate to be able to work closely with them in embedding lighter living not only in our own organization, but also throughout our service region. We're so grateful for your leadership and for this special evening we have planned. I truly hope you leave here tonight with inspiration to do more and increased awareness about how we as individuals and as a community can make a very meaningful impact towards our changing climate. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Emily. And we're also here in SFU, so I want to invite Paige Smith, who's the program assistant at SFU's Vancity Office of Community Engagement. They do a lot to advance social and environmental justice and community partnerships. So over to you, Paige. Oh, you're right here, I see you.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to SFU. Thank you so much for coming. Like Vanessa said, I'm Paige Smith. And as she said, I'm the programming assistant for SFU's Vancity Office of Community Engagement. So we do a lot of different programming for the public, and one of our key focuses is social and environmental justice. So that's why we're so happy to be partnered on this event. We do this kind of work through public programming. We do work to try and mobilize knowledge and to create creative engagement. So I think this event aligns with everything we're trying to do, so we're really excited to be partnered on it. So I hope you all have a great night.
Wonderful. And then the City of Vancouver. So Brad Bedelt is here. He is working with the City of Vancouver. He is a part of the leadership team around sustainability in the city. And we've had a chance to work together for many years also on the Greenness City project and the kind of action plan for the future. So to you, Brad.
Thank you, everyone, for joining us here tonight. My name is Brad Bedelt. I'm the Assistant Director of Sustainability with the City of Vancouver. I'll start by saying thank you to Vanessa and Dagmar and the whole One Earth team for hosting this awesome event. It's so nice just to be in this space with all these people, so thank you very much. Thank you to Janice for the warm welcome. That was a great way to get us started. And thank you also to SFU and Vancity for supporting the event tonight. I've been with the city for about 7 years now, and I came to the city really to work on the Greenness City Action Plan. And so it gives me a lot of pleasure to be here tonight to talk briefly about ecological footprint and the Greenness City Action Plan and where we're heading next with that. There's a goal within the Greenness City Action Plan. There's actually 10 goals. I won't do a pop quiz, but one of the 10 is focused on reducing ecological footprint. And from what I understand, 10 years ago, it was a difficult goal. It was the most difficult goal of all to land in that plan because it's really focused on individual choices and behavior, which for most cities is not the stuff we do. We build bike lanes, we regulate building code, but trying to influence the stuff people buy, the food we eat, is not a space that cities got into 10 years ago. A lot has changed in 10 years. I would say right now most leading cities in the world are really getting into this space, are seeing that lighter living and individual action and collective action is a huge need for cities to collaborate with and enable and support. And the City of Vancouver is one of those. And I think we saw an example of that just over a week ago with 100,000 people out in the streets marching for climate action. That sort of collective action is hugely powerful. Earlier this year, our City Council passed a climate emergency motion, and that was in part to the action of youth. The Friday Climate Strikes, the Sustainability Teens, City Hive, and other organizations like that. Those actions are having an impact, and if people don't recognize that they truly are. I can say from inside City Hall that those actions are pushing staff and they're pushing City Council. So our council passed the climate emergency motion in the spring, and they've directed staff to come back in the fall of 2020 with a robust plan to accelerate climate action. So what does that mean? Over the last 10 years with the Greenness City Plan, we've been working pretty hard. We've reduced greenhouse gas emissions in the city by about 15%. While the city has grown. So not bad. We need to reduce it by 50% by 2030, which is a huge task. So it really speaks to collective action and partnership with organizations, which are filling this room right now, but organizations across the city. So we're starting to work on that plan that will go back to council in the fall of 2020 now. It will be the next Greenness City Action Plan, and we're really excited to be starting work on it. We're excited to be here tonight and hear some of the ideas coming up in the discussion. There is a slide that will be coming up in a moment that has a QR code, I think. If you hold up your phone, this will do something. It will send you somewhere that will connect you to the City of Vancouver Sustainability Group. And if it doesn't work, that address will also take you to the same place, I'm fairly certain. So if you sign up for this, you are then part of our distribution list. When we start to roll out the climate emergency response plan, you will be part of the information and part of the engagement as that goes forward. We're really excited about it. The real engagement starts in January. We've got an awareness program kicking off very shortly, but we look forward to hearing more tonight in terms of your ideas and hopes from that. And before I step off, I just want to put a quick plug in for the EcoCity World Summit, and I know Jennie's going to talk about it, but it's a huge event next week and a great opportunity to go and learn about what other cities around the world are doing to advance EcoCity. So thank you.
Wonderful. Well, Thank you so much, Brad, and for the work that you're doing. And so a couple of things. First, just to say how the evening's going to unfold. So we've had a bit of a meet time. We've had a chance to hear from our co-hosts. We'll now just spend some time sharing some of the thinking around lighter living, some ideas. Then we'll have a chance to talk with each other and then to take action for those of us who want to take the next steps together. And the other thing I want to say is that I have some sad news. So Louis Akenji, who's a dear friend of ours, was on his way from Europe to Vancouver, very excited to be here, when en route he received the information of a family health emergency that was so dire that he had to turn around and go back to Europe. So we found that out last night. We're sending lots of strength to him for this critical moment, and we've been able to kind of rework with the One Earth team the keynote. I've actually had a chance to present with Louis a number of times internationally, so I'm going to be channeling Louis, and we're also going to bring him into the room in a second in a video. And also, I'm pleased that Ryu Koide, who's from the Japanese Institute for Global Environmental Strategies and worked with Louis on the 1.5 degree lifestyles report, is here tonight with us. So big warm welcome, Ryu, as well. So I'm glad you're here. There he is. So myself, Ryu, Bill, and Jennie are going to try and fill Louis's amazing shoes. And so I'll get us started, and then I'll bring Ryu up, and then Bill, Jennie, and then share some action ideas with you as well. So how do we actually live happy, healthy lives equitably within the natural systems of the earth? You know, this question is one that our family has been asking for many years. My dad is here in the audience, and he and my mom, who's here in spirit, led my sister and I through lots of opportunities to get to know our connection to the world, both the people and the planet. And it was with them that we first marched when we were 9 and 10 years old, and the march against nuclear energy, nuclear bomb testing. And from that time also became quite active in the environmental movement. So here's us in 1990 marching just down the street where the climate march ended up happening a few days ago. And Doug Reagan, who's in the room right now, and Tara Cullis, who's the president of the David Suzuki Foundation, is here tonight as well. These past 30 years, we've been working together to really focus on this question of lighter living. And you see Jeff Gibbs up in the corner here. He was the co-founder of the Environmental Youth Alliance, the real leader. And Doug Reagan really took it to the next level. And he's here because of the EcoCity World Summit as well. So wonderful chance. And we actually have the executive director of Environmental Youth Alliance here as well tonight. So wonderful to have all of you here.
Doug's now with the United Nations.
Yeah, he's with the UN Habitat. This is my sister. So here you see us. So Dagmar and I marched with her family. Andrew Robinson, her husband, is here as well, and their 2 children. And it was them who said, you know, what can I do? What can we do? And the reality is that a lot of times when we get asked that question, we get these lists, right? You know, collect and save water, say no to junk mail, buy used goods. These are incredibly important things, but it kind of feels out of scale for the challenge that we're faced with. And so we do think about what kind of effect do everyday actions have. And some say, like the BBC, that we can't all be Greta, but our choices can have a ripple effect. But then there's others who are concerned that focusing on individuals' approaches to sustainability is very convenient for corporations to take the eye off of these larger systems. So the good news is these don't have to be either or. If we think about lighter living, we can think about the fact that actually, when you look at it, household emissions account for 72% of global greenhouse gas emissions. How is that possible? Isn't it just a small percentage with the little choices we make? No, because when we start looking at the research, we show that our household consumption extends all the way upstream to the production systems that create the houses, mobility systems, financial systems, and all of the food systems that nurture our daily lives. In fact, a number of academics have found that we can actually get to our 1.5 degree targets without these massive negative emission technologies like carbon capture and storage by shifting demand. And cities around the world are realizing they can't just look inside their geographical boundaries. at what's happening inside their city in terms of greenhouse gas emissions, they also need to think about their consumption-based greenhouse gas emissions. So this is the greenhouse gas emissions from household use of fuel, electricity, goods and services that are produced in the city, but also ones that are imported. And of course, those have indirect upstream effects. In fact, they're quite massive. So if you just look at sectors, so inside a city, that's the amount, 0.9 gigatons of carbon dioxide for 79 C40 cities. But when you add consumption-based carbon emissions, you get up to 2.2 gigatons extra, because then we have to look at what is fueling the life we live today. And across those 79 cities, in fact, 80% of them, that was the larger amount of their greenhouse gas impact. So C40 cities have a 60% larger carbon footprint than previously estimated because of the scale of emissions generated by the urban consumption of everyday goods and services. And the good news is, when we turn that around, we can actually meet our 1.5 degree scenarios. This is research. Nicole Vandenberg is here as a PhD candidate that I work with. She's doing a lot of number crunching as well around the 1.5 degree emissions scenarios. And this Grubler et al. Paper is one that she was also looking at in detail. It basically says if we downsize the global energy system, it allows us it improves the feasibility of a low carbon supply side transformation. So not just, to basically start from the demand. And so that's basically what we want to talk about today. And when you see their graph, I won't go into this chart in detail, but you see that it's both end use, like how comfortable are we in the houses we have, how much heat do we need, what kind of goods do we have, what kind of mobility, but it also goes upstream to look at the kinds of industry needed to fuel our lives, and includes things like aviation and shipping. So why don't we talk about this? Well, one chapter in a book about consumption-based carbon emissions talked about these solutions, for example, reducing meat consumption, aviation. The majority of policymakers and analysts are so ideologically committed to maximizing growth that it's impossible for them to consider these alternatives. The reality is, I think that conversation could be starting to change. And there's a real urgency around it. So this is where I get to bring Lewis into the room. I'm going to show you a clip from his speech from the World Circular Economy Forum in 2018 in Yokohama. And I think it's important to note that Lewis Akenji, who is now the executive director of SEED, a social innovation organization that does work around the world on sustainable innovation, and has worked for a long time with Ryu and others at the Institute for Global Environmental Strategies. He spoke directly after the head of Coca-Cola for Japan, who was speaking about recycled bottles, recycled materials in bottles, and the recovery of those bottles, and their being brought back into reuse. And they were mentioning both the Coca-Cola's water and Coke bottles. So he was using both. It's important for you to know so you can hear what Lewis is speaking to as well.
So I have a question. Let's say you went to a supermarket this morning to get your breakfast and all you wanted was jam. And you walked in and you're stunned by 1,000 eco labels and you have to spend time selecting. Just pick one, they say. There's a sign of recyclable on it. There's an eco label on it. And you just get confused, paralysis, and you end up being dissatisfied with what you get anyway. So this leads to my first message. We are not going to get circular by simply sticking an eco label on a plastic bottle. And it kind of makes me wonder, why would you need to sell bottled water in a country like Japan where the water is so clean, just so we can create plastic and then recycle it? Right, so let's look at the shape of tomorrow. One of my first messages I'm going to give you is that we have heavily underestimated the challenge ahead of us. And unfortunately, there's a pattern where we're being summarily looked at as consumers rather than families, households, communities, people that want to go about their everyday living. Now, what does tomorrow look like? I'm going to start with the work that is being done at the Institute by some of our colleagues. We used to ask the question, what is it to be or not to be And then we're in an era of materialism where we say to have or not to have. So I ask you, is the question to be or to have?
So we have heavily underestimated the challenge ahead of us. And unfortunately, there's a pattern where we're being looked at as consumers rather than families, households, and communities, people who want to go about their everyday lives, everyday living. So let's look at Maria. She's got a lot of stresses in her life. Maybe this feels very familiar, just trying to make sure she gets to work on time, gets the kids on time, all those kinds of things. And she feels a lot like on this hamster wheel where she might feel more like a human having than a human being, right? There's just this constant pressure. So when she flops down on the couch at night, she might also get an offer on her phone for an eco lunchbox that's made of sustainable materials, and she just purchases it and gets a bit of a dopamine hit from that. Because she's also been reading about the kind of climate crisis, and she's quite concerned, but is not quite sure how to be engaged in this. Maria's mostly thinking about her needs and the aspects of her needs and values that drive her life, like affection and participating in her community and feeling like she's contributing, that she has a capacity to better her life. But she's also aware that there's a lot of systems that determine how our energy use and greenhouse gas emissions get produced. So the economy, education systems, policy systems, infrastructure, culture, that kind of streams in that way. And she could feel very disconnected from trying to make those things happen. And she knows, I think like all of us knows, Maria knows that green consumerism is not going to buy our way out of this because of these eco labels, but also because it just feels too small. And she knows that there's these tensions, right? That we have a nature over demand, our resources are finite, that there's this imbalance of access to resources, that there's this natural sink overload, that we've created more waste than we can absorb. These are the tensions of our current lifestyles, and she doesn't want to leave her children a Mad Max future. She doesn't want to see things kind of descend into that. And at the same time, she feels like when I say to her, well, we need to reduce our footprints by 90% in the developed countries, she feels just overwhelmed, and she feels like it's also blaming just the consumer for this need, for this goal, or asking us to solve it. So how do we go about finding solutions for sustainable living? Well, the first thing we need to do is redefine those tensions as principles. Living within ecological boundaries, having justice and fairness and access and opportunity, and really focusing on redefining well-being, guided by individual and societal well-being. So it's my pleasure to now bring up Rio Koide, who's been looking at the specifics of the urgency of this. He is a policy researcher at the Institute for Global Environmental Strategies, and this 1.5-degree lifestyles report looks at the targets and actions for reducing lifestyle carbon footprints. It was just released in February of this year, and it's also with Aalto University, DMAT, Citra, and the Hua Foundation. Rio, come on up. Actually, you can come on this side. I'm going to place you in the sunshine here. Right. Great, so I'll give you this. Right, so of course, you define lifestyle carbon footprints in the way that I just spoke about, which is that they directly emit. It's both the greenhouse gas emissions from directly emitted and indirectly induced household consumption. So excluding those from government consumption. Could you tell us what you found? Here's the slide to bring everybody up to speed.
Yes, sure. Thank you. So what we've proposing here is the per capita per year footprint target, long-term and mid-term. And what we're saying here is a 3-to-1 toned approach, roughly speaking. So the average of the consumer's footprint as of now is 4.5 to 5 tons globally, but it should be reduced to 3 tons by 2030. By 2050, 2040, it's going to be 2 tons and then 1 ton by 2050. And if you consider like 1.5 degrees target without relying on negative emission technology like CCS, which is quite dangerous, we'd say, because of the probability issue, we need to reduce a bit further more, 2.5, 1.4, 0.7 tons.
So that's huge.
Yes, huge. Actually, it was depressing for us, all of the research team. Oh my God, we found out this. It's great, but how we do it?
How are we going to do this?
Yeah.
So, and you looked actually at Brazil, Finland, China, India, and Japan. What are the scales of reductions for each country?
Yes, so these case study countries, you can see the footprint here as a bar chart. Our Finnish colleague, our colleague from Finland, they have 10.4, and Japanese has 7.6, and China, Brazil, India 4.2, roughly speaking 3 ton and 2 ton. And it's really massive reduction necessity we found out. As you know, it's 80 to 90% reduction for Japanese and Finnish are pretty much similar to other developed countries. But another striking thing for us is that even developing countries, they exceed 2050 target or even 2030 target. So we need to start thinking about how we can bring everyone in this globe to this lighter living or the living within a planetary boundary.
Yeah, and of course it's across these different sectors because you looked at sorry, yes, did you want to say something else around that?
No, sure.
Yeah, so we were basically looking across the big sectors: nutrition, housing, mobility, consumer goods, leisure, and services. And when we looked at food, so here is a typical meal in Finland for a bigger dinner party. This is Peter Menzel's work where he looked at a family and what they eat in a month. So this is Japan, the Ukita family.
Very typical.
Very typical. Thanks.
Too many things, materials. Yeah.
And then in Brazil, the New York Times just did family meals around the world. This is from Sao Paulo, Brazil, and the kind of food that they're eating on a typical night. Mm-hmm. So what you did is you compared them across these different countries. And so along the bottom, you see the amount of kilograms per capita per year of the food consumption. So you see there's more being consumed in Finland than Brazil, for example. But then you see the carbon intensity up the left-hand side. So I'm going to turn it over to you. Let's talk about the story here.
Oh, yes. So it's been really interesting to compare our case countries. As you can see from here, in Finland, most of the emissions hotspot is from meat and dairy product. And it's been like, they have been also saying that we need to reduce cheese consumption or, this dairy consumption because it's quite high carbon, in addition to meat consumption. Yeah. But that story was not exactly same for Japan. For example, dairy consumption in Japan, this lighter blue bar is quite small. So maybe in case of Japan, it's not the main part, but of course the red one, meat, has quite high carbon intensity, like over 8 to 9 kilogram of CO2 per kilogram food. But in Japan, maybe rice consumption or fish consumption, these are also a little bit of concern. So we need to also think about how to make this rice consumption sustainable as well. And in case of Brazil, beans and meat consumption are quite impactful part. And across, if you compare Brazil with other developing countries, actually their food footprint is relatively higher, probably because of the higher meat consumption.
Yeah, that's right. So in Brazil, they do have some really great menus that have beans in them, which we should all learn from. And then they've also got, of course, their tradition of eating steak. So you see some of those kinds of tensions there. And then in transport, you compared across these different countries. So do you want to speak a little bit to what you found there?
Yes, sure. So it's much, we have much more large diversity between countries. Like for Finland, first of all, the footprint itself is very different. From Finland, it's 3 ton per capita, and Japan is 1.5 ton. China, India, Brazil is less than 1 ton per capita per year. And in case of Finland, car is quite large part, but also for Japan, the red part. But our colleagues have been saying that, Japan has maybe better lifestyle. I'm not sure. Train and metro has it's serving. It's quite used quite often. Well, but you can also notice this little dotted line, broken line. That's actually the target. If you downscale this 3 to 1 ton into So we assign this 3 to 1 ton to mobility domain, and it's very small, but you cannot see it very obviously. But even for Japan, it's really overshooting. It's we need to reduce like 80% or 70% or 90%. So it's really challenging. I mean, how we do this? It's not just about intensity, like providing low carbon options, but maybe we should also think about how we address this amount of mobility, like maybe telework or other way of living. Like we don't move around so much, but maybe we can live sustainably with high well-being.
Well, that's a great point, Rio, because I think with lighter living, we often focus on the technology. So how do we still use a car, but use an efficient car? It might be a hybrid one. But I think what was really interesting to me and what I think was interesting about the report is it looked at 3 major solutions. What you're just speaking to, why are we moving? What are we eating? How often are we eating? How are we living? What kind of electricity are you using? And actually looking at amount reductions in that. Then you have those efficiency gains, smaller consumption, but same consumption but smaller carbon intensity. So this would be the hybrid car, or perhaps moving from more meat-based to a plant-based diet. And then you can also have these modal shifts. So you can actually shift towards a bus, say if you're driving a car. So they've also been called avoid, shift, and improve. So you might want to avoid, as you're saying, some of these lengthy trips. We could shift to a cleaner mode or improve the fuel consumption, for example, of a car. And then you kind of did a big calculation of all of the low carbon lifestyle options for Japan.
Yes, actually we did it for Japan and Finland. So what we did is like reviewing different literature and then identifying what kind of lifestyle changes it's possible to make a lifestyle low carbon. And what we found out is that, it's been also said in another literature that the kind of low carbon options which is being used in Japanese education or even government awareness raising, it's talking about very little thing, like turning off the light. That's also important, of course, or maybe like giving more space to your refrigerator and between the wall, or eco driving, that's like not do like rapid acceleration. But before that, let's think about that. How many refrigerators do you have at home? Or do you need to really use car before talking about eco driving? So what we did is that we try to focus on systemic changes, which is like to make a rapid reduction, even increasing that avoid or reduction approaches. So for example, in the case of Japan, for housing, before maybe, of course we should save energy, but maybe shifting the electricity to renewable electricity is really have a big impact, and we should do that quite soon. And also maybe insulation, improvement in insulation, or in case of mobility, shifting to electric vehicle, but also public transport, or maybe you can relocate your home to closer to workplace, or maybe introduce telework if your employer allows. Or maybe closer weekend leisure rather than going to overseas holidays. Or in case of food, like vegetarian or vegan diet, or shifting from the red meat to white meat or fish consumption. Or maybe some of us have been eating too much probably, and maybe has other issue. So reducing overeating part, that's good for your health.
It's also good for your health.
Same whole like public transport and bicycle use. Why not, if it's healthier and low carbon, why not we do it?
Absolutely.
Yeah,
go ahead, Doreen.
Yeah, just one point. I couldn't talk about that, but I'm sorry to say, but I'm almost sure that Canadians' footprint is much larger than Japanese and Finnish, I think.
It is.
Oh, yes, here we have Professor Bill. So, we still haven't covered Canada, but hope maybe sometime in the future, maybe we can do it for Vancouver or Canada as well. And the good point is that, we have an international team, so we can compare actually. And actually some of the low carbon is culture specific. So it's very interesting, like maybe Finnish, our colleague said that, this Japanese option is useful for Finland, so we can exchange.
Exactly. And I think what you're getting at also about some people over-consuming, and there's also under-consumers. So part of what we want to do is actually look at vulnerable populations that might not have enough. And so there is both of those issues going on at the same time. And actually, Jennie Moore did do calculations for Vancouver and for many other places to find out how we can shift our approach here in terms of footprints from the ground up, really using bottom-up data, which has been instrumental for all of us to know if we're moving in the right direction. And you talked also about adoption rates. like how many people actually take it on. So, when you looked at, a 75% adoption of these different activities, you could actually get to this 1.5 degree target.
Yeah, so this is like after identifying these individual options, we calculated what will be the aggregated impact on the reduction of carbon footprint, and this was again depressing actually.
Yeah.
We listed 30 options, including vegetarian or living up your car, and assuming average Japanese or maybe say all Japanese people 70%, and on average. Assuming that 75% of the Japanese take these options, 30 options, all of them, then we can finally reach 1.5 degree target. It's really challenging.
Yeah.
So the point is that we cannot do it by just individual actions, by consumers' effort alone. So it's really about a system, including infrastructure, or maybe you cannot buy low carbon product if it's not sold in the nearest supermarket, for example, or you don't have bus services. Or bicycle lanes. So it's about a system, but also individual effort. And the point I'd like to emphasize is we shouldn't make like delay of actions by blaming other stakeholders. It's quite typical that a consumer needs to do something or a company needs to do something, and like a dichotomy between this production and consumption. But we need to really start doing both things soon.
Great. Thank you, Ryu.
Oh, yes.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
So before I hand it over to Bill, I'm just going to say that these are some of the things Lewis wanted to share. We need to give up some things sooner rather than later for those of us who are over-consuming, which is many of us. But also it's a large, unprecedented capacity development challenge, right, for individuals and change organizations to imagine life differently, to accept radical solutions. We can't just focus on technology. It's much more than technology. And it's really about individual action and structural change that Rio was just mentioning, because there is this attitude behavior gap where we say we'd like to do something, but we need to be enabled to do that, and we need that collective responsibility. So we need new institutions, business models. We need to look beyond the market to completely new approaches to meeting needs and wants. And the scale and urgency, let's not fall into the small action trap of just recycling better, but prioritize actions that generate momentum and return, have a high return potential, and focus on these hot spots, but not get lost in the silos, but look at changes that come together and reduce the amounts and intensity of consumption. And he wanted to leave you with, be brave, be very brave in terms of how we're doing this. And there's a person who's always very brave and always so bold and has inspired me for many, many years and is a great colleague. He is the professor emeritus in the University of British Columbia. He is the founder of the Ecological Footprint Analysis. He is a co-founder of One Earth, and he's a fantastic human being. And he's going to tell you how the storm is approaching. Bill.
I started to wonder who she was introducing there for a moment. There are lots of things we can do. There's no question about it. And these guys have done a fantastic job. If you can get a hold of that report, it's well worth reading. But if there isn't the social context and the institutional support for people to do these things, they don't do them. There are several studies that show that the best environmentally educated people on Earth have exactly the same consumption patterns and lifestyles as people who don't give a goddamn about the environment in the same income bracket. So this is a huge cognitive problem. There's a tremendous difficulty in motivating people to do the things that have to be done. And I could spend the whole rest of the evening just telling you what the psychological barriers are that create that kind of constraint. I'm not going to do that. I'm going to do something much more difficult. I want to take us back to the kind of big picture from which we're operating here. We have to understand something fundamental that no government has understood in any reasonable manner, that the Earth is already in a state of overshoot. If you're going to talk about lighter living, this is where you've got to start. Overshoot means that we are consuming natural capital, the products of nature, ecosystems themselves, much faster than they can regenerate. And we're filling natural waste sinks to overflowing. Climate change is a waste management problem. Carbon dioxide is the single largest waste by weight of industrial economies, okay? So all of the symptoms of collapsing biodiversity, land degradation, climate change, and so on and so forth are simply that, symptoms of overshoot, of gross human ecological dysfunction. We have ceased to be citizens of the planet. We have turned ourselves, through our technological optimism, our growth fetish, into parasites on the planet. We are literally consuming the biosphere, converting it into human bodies, animal bodies, and all of the artifacts of our culture, and in the process, inevitably diminishing nature. It is an absolute contradiction to say that you can have even green growth and conserve the so-called environment, because all growth involves the consumption of material and the dissipation of energy, which means a further encroachment on the domain of nature that remains. Do you know that in pre-industrial times, well, pre-agricultural times, human beings constituted far less than 1% of the mammalian biomass of Earth? 10,000 years later, the human mass is 34% of the mammalian biomass on planet Earth. Our domestic animals are an additional 60%. So together, we comprise over 95%, actually, of the biomass of mammalian critters on the planet, leaving nature that remaining 4.5%. Those great herds of Africa are just living on the fringes of existence because we've literally, through our growth, displaced them from their ecosystems and their habitats. So we are now sustaining the growth ethic by growing, by permanently dissipating the very biophysical basis of our own existence. This is what it looks like. It's an unsustainable fossil fuel-driven exponential growth. For 10,000 years, nothing happened. We didn't grow. For the last 200 years, we've been engaged in a process of exponential or super exponential growth. It produces this inordinate hockey stick graph. But we have to understand that only 7 generations of 20,000 generations of human beings have experienced sufficient growth even to notice it in their lifetimes. It's just our last few generations. Yet we take this to be the norm. What we think of in our culture as the norm is the single most anomalous or abnormal period in the history of the human species. The global picture is this, and all of the numbers that we've heard about so far, the big reductions of 70, 80, 90% are based on this simple fact. We're in 68% overshoot by the most conservative of our eco-footprint measurements. So we are literally consuming the planet out from under us, and it means increasingly every one of us is competing with everyone else for the ever-diminishing capacity of this planet. This week, a new report came out about the plunging loss of tuna in the seas. It's just one of many fisheries in dire straits. As more and more people rise higher on the income chain and start eating more and more meat, we're not going to eat less meat. The trend on the planet is more and more meat consumption as incomes grow, because that's what people do unless there's a social environment, a cultural environment, a political environment to turn that around. It happened extremely quickly. Get your head around these numbers, because we're in the fishbowl. We don't notice the water. Homo sapiens, the recognizable modern anatomical species that we are, is about 200,000 years old. It took 200,000 years virtually to hit 1 billion people. That's a long, flat period. But then the population expanded by 7.5-fold in 200 years. 1/2000th, or rather 1/1000th as much time as it took to reach the first billion. And in the meantime, gross world product increased by 100%, or 100-fold rather, not 100%, 100-fold in real terms. Per capita incomes increased by a factor of 13, 25-fold in rich countries, and fossil energy consumption, which powered this growth, increased in 200 years by 1,300-fold. And the Earth hasn't grown any larger. And if you doubt the relationship between the human population, the scale of the human enterprise, and energy consumption, here is a comparison of the population plus per capita consumption and total consumption. They're virtually identical curves. Take away the energy, the whole rest of the system collapses. Here's another consequence of exponential growth. The area under the curve represents the total consumption that took place in the period that we're talking about. 50% of all the fossil fuel ever used on planet Earth has been consumed in the last 30 years. Did you hear what I said? 50% of all the fossil fuel ever consumed, 50% of the human emissions of carbon dioxide in the last 30 years. 90% of all the fossil fuels ever used have been burned in my lifetime. This is how incredibly compressed this time scale has become as a result of this exponentiating kind of growth. Now, fossil fuel is the basis upon which our society is based. We are suspended on a fountain of oil. Take that away and the whole thing crashes if you don't have a viable substitute. Just look around you. It's just energy, 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 energy everywhere. Okay? And it's not just fossil fuel, it's everything else that has increased at that same exponentiating rate. And we all now rely on efficiency. Efficiency will save the day. These enormous increases in consumption of just about everything, half of all fossil fuels in 30 years, have taken place during a period of unprecedented increases in the efficiency of everything that we do. Okay? So, we are already in overshoot. Here's the question we all have to face. Do any of you really think the ecosphere could survive another doubling of human economic activity and associated impacts as is expected by 2050? Because in the doubling, look, with exponential growth, the increment gained in any single period is equal to the sum of all the gains made in all previous periods of exponential growth. So if everything were to double again in the next 30 years, we will consume in the next 30 years everything we've already consumed up to date. And to date, don't forget, is, well, I've already given you those numbers. So here's the really desperate challenge that we've already been introduced to. If we want to avoid catastrophic climate change, we have to hold global temperatures well below 2 degrees above pre-industrial levels and pursue efforts. Listen to this mealy-mouthed language. We're going to pursue efforts to limit temperature increase to 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels. That means reducing carbon emissions by about 50% below 2010 levels, which are actually lower than today's levels, by 2030. That means that starting right now, every year between now and 2030, that's about 11 years, 7% reduction every year. I will bet my entire income for the next year that we won't reduce carbon emissions by 7% in the next year, or the year after that, or the year after that. We need complete decarbonization by 2050 if we're going to avoid these limits. Well, don't worry about it, because we all know that green energy is taking over. Here are two statements. I just pulled these off the internet. If you look up green energy, bingo, you'll have 150 references to salvation. Solar photovoltaic, and wind power are rapidly getting cheaper and more abundant, so much so that they are on track to entirely supplant fossil fuels worldwide within 2 decades. Boy, doesn't that just make you feel good? An area of Earth 335 kilometers by 335 kilometers, a nice little square, with solar panels out in the Sahara Desert is sufficient to provide us with 17.4 terawatts of power. All the energy needs of the world in solar energy in a little patch of the Sahara Desert. Someone ought to tell this guy that one sandstorm and it's all gone. One sandstorm and it's all gone. Okay? So both of these statements are primarily out there to get people to invest in alternative energy of one kind or another, because clearly it's going to be a boom. I have a very good friend, an energy analyst from Texas, now teaching in Saudi Arabia, actually. This is Pat Seck's corollary. The more you know about the role of energy and its nature in our society, the closer you get to losing all hope. Okay. I think this is brilliant. Now, before you laugh and think, well, he's just a goof nut, look at this curve. This curve shows two things. First, the enormously rapid acceleration of solar energy output on planet Earth. That's the golden curve on the left. It also shows the annual increase in global demand for electricity. So listen to me. The annual increase in demand for electricity in every year but one in the last 20 years or so has been greater than the entire output of all the solar installation that's gone on for the last 30 years. Okay. If you throw wind in here, it takes 2 years of growth at the margin to wipe out all the gains contributed by all the wind and solar energy installed on planet Earth. So that when we look at the big picture, the little gold tribble on the bottom is the contribution by solar energy. The global electricity demand is the red line. It's rising faster than the increase in the alternative. The blue little bit at the end is just showing you 2 years of energy consumption attributable to fossil fuels, which is twice as great as even the power capacity thing. So here's really the choices before us as a culture. I hope I've made my point, that there are no easy substitutes for fossil fuels. There's 2 points. We are utterly dependent on energy to maintain anything remotely like the lifestyle that we have, or even a very considerable, materially less advantageous lifestyle. And there are no substitutes for the fossil fuel at present. And none, frankly, on the foreseeable future. I mean, people will come up to me and say, "You're full of, you know what, because fission energy is almost ready to come out, or fusion energy." Listen, I've been in this game a long time. For 50 years, fusion energy was right around the corner. So don't expect that to save your butt anytime soon. And by the way, has it occurred to any of the energy advocates that if we continue to use energy from whatever source, as we use it today, we'll just consume the rest of the planet and go down anyway, okay? It's just not on. You cannot have the rates of consumption. Actually, it's a conversion process. The wild of nature into the human artifact, but we need the wildness of nature, the life support functions to keep us going. So here's our choices. I've got 2 minutes to... That was my introductory remarks. So what... We can avoid disastrous climate change. We could. We could program rapid cutbacks in fossil fuels in the absence of adequate substitutes. This would risk high unemployment and business failures, put cities in jeopardy, trigger civil unrest, and lead to social chaos and economic collapse. That's a pretty comforting option, isn't it all? Or we can risk accelerating climate change, maintain our allegiance to the growth paradigm and the illusion of rescue by technology, continue with fossil fuels as a primary energizer, risk desertification, biodiversity collapse, food shortages, mass migrations, social chaos, and economic collapse. Fine choices we're putting up for ourselves. Now, everything that Rio said is true. We could, should we choose to do so, and create the appropriate socio-political policy environment, reduce our emissions by 50% without suffering, because we waste that much. But we won't do it without those preconditions that I've mentioned. Now, here's my prediction. The world will choose the second option. The world will choose the second option. Because the economy, in the minds of the culture we have created, is always more important than everything. We have to maintain a balance between the economy and nature. But keep in mind, it's a confined space. So every time the economy grows, there's less nature. There's no balance. It's constantly going out of balance as the growth dynamic occurs. And there's evidence that my prediction isn't wrong. This is a graph showing all the climate agreements over the last 50 years or so. Okay? That red line is the annual ticky-uppedness of the carbon emissions. Okay, it fluctuates on an annual basis, but it's a steady, exponentially increasing rise in carbon emissions. You cannot detect any change in the trajectory of that curve attributable to any of the many climate accords that have been signed over the many decades. We simply haven't paid any attention to our own commitments. Therefore, this is last week's publication from the U.S. Energy Information Agency, but it coincides almost identically with minor variations with the International Energy Agency. They predict that by 2050, in this case, that's our target, remember, we're going for zero emissions by 2050. Unfortunately, by then, global demand for energy, since it's absolutely necessary to maintain the growth ethic, will increase by 44%. And most of that will be provided by fossil fuel. In fact, the increase is greater than the total amount that will be provided by all alternatives, including hydro and so on, over that same period. So, what you guys have got to understand is that the destruction of the planet is apparently the price the world community is willing to pay to maintain our economic trajectory. This is what we should do right now. First of all, every politician in this campaign should stand up and acknowledge overshoot and the end of growth. We should accept the theoretical and practical difficulties of a green energy transition. We should restructure the economy to remain within the allowable carbon budget while developing sustainable alternatives. They may be out there, we just don't have them just yet. We should, on an emergency basis, be allocating the remaining carbon budget through depletion taxes, rationing, quotas to essential uses. Our food system is entirely dependent on fossil fuel. You couldn't survive in this city 3 days after a collapse of the fossil fuel sector, because that's all the food there is in town. It has to be brought in constantly from elsewhere, all over the world. We need then essential uses, food production, home heating, essential transportation to provision cities, for example. We need to relocalize economic activity. You know what? Right now, there are ships traveling from North America to Europe full of biscuits. There are ships traveling from Europe to North America full of biscuits. As Herman Daly, one of my great mentors, said, why not trade recipes? Shipping, by the way, is an enormous source of fossil fuels. Develop sustainable lifestyles. Even North Americans lived happily, more happily than now, in the 60s and 70s on less than half the energy per capita that we consume today. We need to implement a global population strategy to plan a descent to the 2 or 3 billion people who could live comfortably and sustainably, indefinitely within the biophysical means of nature. So there, you got a job ahead of you, buck up, it's a great life.
Thanks, Bill. And so Dr. Jennie Moore also really looked into the numbers around the ecological footprint. She's the Institute Director for BC Institute for Technology and also the head of this EcoCity World Summit that's coming up this week and a senior associate with One Earth. Jennie, your reflections on what you've just heard and of what we have in front of us. Jennie.
Hey. All right, I agree with Bill. So just a couple things I noticed when we were looking at the numbers that came out of the 1.5 degree low carbon lifestyles. Of course, Vancouver maps very closely to Finland in terms of red meat and dairy having a big impact on our footprint. Vancouver does better than the rest of Canada, thanks in large part to our high hydroelectric capabilities. We're doing great in terms of our building energy efficiency, which is a real success story, I think, over the last 10 years during the time that we've had the Greenness City Action Plan. We've seen tremendous progress there. Our footprint's coming down also in the area of food generally, but Canadians are generally choosing to eat a little bit less red meat. It's the same, interestingly, for Japan. For us, One Planet Living would look like a reduction in red meat consumption by 50%, 50% less food waste, etc. But as Bill points out, even if we did everything, and you know what, my PhD research, very similar approach as the 1.5 degree low carbon lifestyles, looking at how big is the gap, what do we need to do to bring it down, what are the big actions, and for us, it is about reducing red meat 50%, it is about reducing wasted food 50%, it's about improving our energy efficiency overall by at least 40%, it's about reducing our vehicle transportation substantially to the point where we would take more than 80% of our trips by walking, cycling, and transit, and I think that's something we already achieve in the downtown core of Vancouver, but not as across the region. And finally, we'd have to reduce our consumables by at least 50% because 90% of the energy materials and everything that we touch is in the supply chain. Right? So managing our waste is great, but when we're managing our waste, we're managing less than 10% of the total impact of everything that's gone into producing it in the first place. So these are just some of the ideas. Now, that's for sustainable lifestyles. I haven't even started to talk about what happens with the global economy in terms of national government services, the treasury, the military. Those things eclipse what we can do with our footprint. So it's both, right? It's not either or, it's both and. As we start to choose to reduce our footprint, we were setting ourselves up for policy decisions that can be bolder, that can start to move in a better direction. But unless we also pay attention to what's going on with government services and the way that governments enable industry to not take full accountability for supply chain inefficiencies, to encourage us to continue to divest ourselves of investing in natural capital to secure a sustainable future, all of these things, the gross capital infrastructure of our cities alone, we continue to invest in building cities that are unsustainable because we simply don't know what else to do, right? We can't maintain our infrastructure burden. We know that nationally, we know that locally. But how do we actually live differently, right? Is it really going to be concrete and steel all the time to maintain these big structures? There's great new material science that's coming, but that gross capital formation, that government service piece is equivalent to the entire footprint that I just described about our lifestyles. So getting to One Planet Living means that we have to do our part and our governments have to do, with industry, their part. And that's really going to be a hard challenge. And I agree with Bill, like, we've known it for a long time. It's not new news. I think what the big opportunity for us, though, is that everybody's scared now. We see now the impacts, right? So it's not coming. There's no more hope. We used hope as a sedative, right, as a bomb. As long as there's hope, I didn't have to do anything. It's just like a person who's a chain smoker. Do I have cancer yet? No? Okay. But then we can change very quickly. Now that we know what's happening, I don't think we're going to get out of collapse. Collapse is here. People are dying, as Greta Thunberg likes to say. People are dying now. It's true. They have been for a decade already. But there are massive things that we can change. And very, very quickly, it's just a decision. It's changing those practices and those habits. It's working with government or with business so that we actually get very quickly on the change path. And so in Europe, they're already reducing meat consumption very quickly. It's dropped all of a sudden. You know, we're seeing people start to make just easy choices. All of a sudden, it becomes easy. As our social norms change, taking the bus becomes a little bit easier. So I hope, I don't want to end on a down note, but I do want to just push one thing around EcoCity World Summit. What I'm so impressed by in terms of who's coming to this summit, a lot of people who are on the front lines. So we have a lot of engagement from Africa, from Latin America, from Middle East places, where they're already living the reality that we are super insulated here in the Pacific Northwest, right? The good news is you're here, don't leave. This is the most resilient ecosystem in the world. But this is the reality is that it's hitting hard in these places all around the world. And so for an eco-city, very quickly, what would it look like? Massive restructuring and contraction. We will not be able, as Bill points out, we will not be able to drive even electric cars in the future. That's not an option because the embodied energy in the vehicles themselves is already 20% of the entire transportation footprint. So the energy is 50%. But that embodied energy in the vehicles is significant, and then there's air travel. So, there's just going to be a massive restructuring of our cities and how we live. But the positive thing is we're going to choose it because it's actually a matter of survival, right? It's not going to be an option. Both, whatever we do, we're going to choose it because we have to for survival. And the biggest thing for us is going to be to do it together. Because my biggest fear is if we start fighting each other, then we're done, right? Then we'll just kill each other and a few people will survive, and that'll be that. But we can use our intelligence, and we're social by nature. We have love in our hearts. That's a human quality, right? So to be human as we plan our way down is going to be our best bet for a safe landing, at least for a majority of us. Well, not the majority of us, but for more than we would have without that. So that would be my appeal around the social sustainability, holding hands together as we deal with this. And good luck. People say, why are you laughing? It's only because I'm in post-grief, because I already dealt with this about 20 years ago. And for me, what's exciting now is that actually we're all waking up to it. Every single person is starting to change. So it is a dynamic time, and who knows where it'll go. Hopefully somewhere safe. Okay, thank you.
Okay, so for those of you who need a drink, you can totally go get one. So I thought what I'd do is just do a solution safari. So the next 7 minutes, I'm going to just go through, you've already heard some solutions. I'm just going to throw out some more, because in a moment, we're going to take a moment to think about what are the things that we can do. So these might trigger some ideas for you about how we can take action for lighter living. So what we're learning is that we're all influencers. So Greta actually said that the point of not flying for her was not only reducing her carbon footprint, but to send that signal that Jennie was just speaking about, that the climate crisis is a real thing, and to build the political movement. In fact, a colleague of ours, Kate Power from the Hua Foundation, she says we're always either contributing to the shift to sustainable living or reinforcing the status quo through our words, our lifestyles, our civic participation. It's not possible to switch off our influence. So there's 3 things I think we can think about in terms of these solution spaces. These high impact solutions, shifting from this thought of us being consumers to really looking at living, at life, and scaling smart. So when we prioritize high-impact solutions, One Earth worked with the United Nations on a report you have at the back there on sustainable lifestyles, options, and opportunities across all the domains. We looked at the highest footprint reducing areas, so these areas that we thought were the most effective in getting the scale of change we've just been speaking to. So, of course it's important to do local food and seasonal food. If we're looking at the energy or footprint reductions, wasted food and plant-rich diet are just the higher more effective for doing that, but we could use local food and seasonal food to bring people into that conversation. But we just want to make sure we keep the numbers in front of us. We can do that for food, and we actually give lists of things you can do inspired by actions around the world. For example, circulating a pledge, but also supporting people to plan meals and shop smart. You can look at those suggested actions that you can do by yourself or with a group across all of these areas. And this is another initiative very similar to that called the Anatomy of Action, which is about cumulative outcomes of our actions as citizens. They do food, goods as stuff, moving, money, fun as leisure. And they have some really cool ways of talking about it, like protein swaps or fashion slowdown or staying curious as a part of leisure and enjoying the journey, right? So it's beyond just the footprint inducing things, but also the things we're going to be moving towards. And you can find Anatomy of Action on the UN website. We'll make sure these slides get sent out, by the way, to the emails that were here, so you can get all these references. You also need to link these actions together across the lifestyle domains. So in the sustainable lifestyles, we looked at leisure and general sustainable lifestyles actions. Think about celebrations. They're not just about food, they're also about the goods that we have there, how we celebrate together. Is it a consumer-focused aspect? Or are you doing things like Zero Waste Iftar Challenge, where they're really looking at how they're celebrating, but also speaking about their connection to the earth as part of the process of this celebration, or shifting the way we do weddings to really think about all the ways that celebrating can really shift and become a signal for new norms. So maybe that's something you'll be committing, like a different way to celebrate. And we're also, what we're learning is that let's focus on collectives, as Bill and Jennie and Rio were speaking to. So in the Sustainable Lifestyles work, we also put out a workplace version of the options. Jim Boothroyd is here, who brought his neighbors together for a 12% reduction in their footprint in a year, just by bringing people together to find solutions. Dagmar, my sister, as well as Cor Halsworth and a number of others, Vancity included, have been moving forward on One Planet Saanich, a really integrative with businesses, governments, schools, all coming together to achieve one planet living. A couple of people coming to the city for the EcoCity World Summit are three people, Marcus Taro, Sari Lane, and Anumanti, who did a Finnish sustainable everyday life. They involved thousands of Finnish people in looking at 100 smart ways to be sustainable. And they looked across all sorts of things from buying a piece of old growth to spending a year as a vegetarian. They figured out that if 2.6 million households in Finland, if two people only reduce their footprints by 20%, they get to 73% of the Finnish national goal around the Paris Agreement, which is still not far enough, as we know, but it's really interesting that they found that it's, even just 20% reductions. And what they also started building together with Ryu as well is this puzzle where you figure out what you need to change in your own life or in your neighborhood, and then you lay it out across a 20-30 timeline. So you might not have to do all of it at once. You could figure out what actions you're going to take and then spread them out over this timeline. And this puzzle is going to be something we'll be putting online. And we have to think about why we consume, because it's really about our identity, right? If you can recognize a hipster from a far distance because they have a certain way of things that they consume and they signal who they are to the world, right? So we have to think about this as well, about our identity and how these things are tied together, but also the societal contexts and habits and social practices. Actually, 40% of what we do is habitual. And it's dynamic and changing across a day, but also across our lives. So if we look at our lives, if we're young or further along in our lives or nearing the end of life, we have these different habits that have happened over time. But there's also moments where we have life transitions, which could be these opportunities where people's habits are already in flux, when they're moving, when they're immigrating to a new place, when they're having a baby, when they're going into retirement. These are powerful moments to actually shift our consumption and production systems and our lifestyle choices. And we have all sorts of new allies, career counselors, wedding and event planners, immigrant welcomers, people who support end-of-life hospice. These are all our allies in shifting ourselves to sustainable lifestyles. This is kind of a pretend future sustainable practice for a city that's welcoming newcomers. So what we're learning is we also need to shift our social practices, the things we see as being normal, and look to traditional practices. Like, why do we shower every day? This is an agreement we have culturally. Even pigs are in on it. No, I'm kidding. But basically, we have these things that we just agree to, right? And so why do we do that? And we can start asking questions about what is seen as being normal. Paul Hawken is coming on Tuesday night to speak at the EcoCity World Summit. He did Project Drawdown to look at the biggest things we can do to reduce our carbon footprints. Look, refrigeration is number one. By the way, notice number 6 and 7 are educating girls and family planning, often areas we need to focus more on when we think about shifting to sustainable futures. Let's look at refrigerants and social practices. And I'll draw on my colleague Marilyn Sahakian from the University of Geneva, who looked at air conditioning in the Philippines. Now, typically, people who lived in elite houses from the 19th century used to sleep on beds like this, but now they sleep in under duvets, right? And that's only possible because of air conditioning. If you look at this gentleman, he's very proud to show off his air conditioner. He's the only one in his community that has one. They used to build for the climate. This is brise soleil, so it was like an overhang so that you really didn't get the heat of the sun. But now west is best is the new practice, right? Eco-efficient buildings and only lead to these kinds of rebound effects. So if they become really efficient, you end up getting more rebound effects. But what about passive cooling in the Philippines? How can you get to more of that? And if you look at fashion and seasonality, these are actual magazines from the Philippines that are encouraging that wealthy individuals could wear wool clothing and sit by the fire in the Philippines for Christmas. And that leads to work attire being focused on much warmer clothes than would be necessary. And so air conditioning needs to happen. So social practice theory can help us think about how we can change the social-cultural dimension, the material dimension, and our dispositions behind the things we see as normal. We can also look to traditional practices. Here's Akansha Chowdhury's work from Cuts International looking at energy-efficient buildings in India. There's a new movement to mud houses again amongst the wealthy. Sharing economies has been around for ages in many of these countries. But also look at these alternatives to air conditioning from other eras, from 1772, that we can go back to, or these multi-cool clay refrigerations, which are actually perfectly fine for most of the things we need refrigerated. So we have a lot of these practices we can come back to as well, and that's just ones from overseas. Let's look to the First Nations here to see what kinds of practices and traditions we can draw on, which Janice, of course, was speaking to. We need to shift policy, markets, and media. Nicole is here in the room. She's looking at, with myself and Lewis and the One Earth team and Detlef van Vuren from the Utrecht University, putting lifestyle options into national government climate models. So when they choose their solutions, they look at the demand side as well as the supply side of changing mobility. We did a toolkit for cities on a sustainable consumption, what city governments can do, and enterprises are getting into things like the share, reuse, repair world. Rosie Cooper is here, who is the lead coordinator for this, as well as Louise Schwartz from Recycling Alternative. Vancity is part of this. It's a group of us working on shifting share, reuse, repair in this area, in this region, and the innovations and markets that need to shift. So finally, quickly, the consuming to living. We need to link footprints to well-being, because our well-being doesn't come from the stuff we have. It comes from our engagement in the world, our sense of self-efficacy fueled by trust. Humans gain life satisfaction from doing things together, especially for others. The Vital Sign Vancouver Foundation report just came out that said the majority of BC is already volunteering, is already out working for a cause or charity. How do we build on that? Sustainable ways of living are also deeply diverse. So here's from a sustainable lifestyle scenario, what Inka does in Finland and how she gets her footprint down is going to be very different from Tomas in Hungary. And the China New Dream project is really looking at moving away from the West is best and creating a new Chinese dream of the future that's reimagining prosperity, reframing sustainability based on Chinese values and norms. It's targeting the Chinese consuming class, and it's looking at attainable aspirations for them, but also doing that through storytelling, catalyzing and curating, and this great actionable steps called Dream in a Box. Finally, scaling smart. The change we're talking about has to happen really rapidly. So how do we do it rapidly and also achieve one of the biggest goals, which is doing it justly? This is about transforming our systems of power and privilege. We have to address this as a political movement, and it's really about highlighting the interests of those who are resistant to change and bringing up those who are vulnerable populations and those that have much deep knowledge about how to shift things in a more sustainable and just way. That all of our solutions need to be inclusive from the start, and they also need to be thinking about both overconsumption and those who are under-consuming. So for example, the Climate Justice Alliance talks about this just transition, which is not just about being waste-free, but the transition itself is just and equitable, redressing past harms and creating new relationships of power for the future through reparations. If the process is not just, the outcome will never be. So the just transition looks at how we're going to get there, and it creates this from an extractive economy to really thinking about this regenerative economy. We're also learning that transformations can be rapid. The Rapid Transition Alliance, a movement that you can join, looks at how movements around the world are actually quite rapidly shifting, the way Jennie was speaking to. It looks at past efforts to change quickly, like wartime efforts, antibiotic resistance, changing diet, the LGBTQ movement, the Me Too movement, and the many elements that lead to rapid transitions. And they found we're actually quite good at adapting to rapid change. But the fairness matters, and public leadership is needed as well as agitation, and there's no one path. We have to be bold and also connect our actions to reasons, because the inaction costs and seemingly hard choices can seem, that's what kind of pushes us along. And creating boundaries, saying this is the boundary of what we need to do, it needs to be just within the Earth's life support systems and increase well-being, that sparks innovation. So you can see in some places this is leading to these changes. Finally, what we're learning is that how we communicate matters. We did a project with the UN about how to actually talk about sustainable lifestyles. We have to start from engaging those stakeholders that we're working with in participatory, relevant, and grounded ways to focus on aspirations and connect them to these clear goals. One Earth and IGES is working together on bringing transformative communications together through a beacon for sustainable living. And that links to the fact that this is a deeply cultural change. So we need to engage the power of story, to ask the question why, and to scale deep to the cultural changes that will really lead to this larger legacy shift that we need to take. So that's where I leave you, with dreaming about the future, and my colleague Blake Robinson's dream of this shantytown in South Africa. And he asked, what could it look like in 2040? And he put forward an image of, with Carl Schulschenk, of what is currently being proposed as the future of the city, of that area. Yes, there's sharing economy, but do you see also the great inequality and the militarization that's happening, the kind of big police state? But what if it was a deeply African vision of what the future could look like? And so they took from all sorts of different aspects, from local economy solutions to the kinds of big shifts in mobility and transportation and biodiversity increases that are needed. And what's interesting is right after this image came out, people started painting these zebra crossings across South Africa. So if we can imagine what sustainable living could look and feel like, we can create it. And so we're also doing a project on envisioning future low-carbon lifestyles with IGES. The opportunity is to imagine these futures, but the challenge is that our futures are limited. We see this, Blade Runner, the road. We need to move beyond these dystopic visions, these technocentric visions. This is a classic view of a city, like a helicopter view, you know, the smart city, the idea of this smart nation, and that's the way that we're going to move forward. Or a lack of imagination. You know, this image is from the UK, and look at this one from a re-envisioned New York. You put them beside each other, and it's kind of a very similar image of what a future could look like. So what if we have an explosion of imagination of what life and sustainable futures could look like? So we're coming out with a report later this year, and we're looking at these principles for guiding this visioning. And here is a sneak peek of some of the things we're starting to envision, like highly connected rural areas, new jobs like sustainability mediators. Perhaps we're all part-time employees and part-time producers of our food. What if education was vastly different? What if we were all part-time city caretakers? And how are we actually going to look at the end of life as part of our sustainable living futures? So when you're thinking about your commitments, think about high-impact areas, link them together, shift those habits, join together for collective action, embrace diverse ways of living, transform power and privilege while lightening lives, challenge our institutions and structures, and mostly also reimagine our sustainable daily lives. And with that, I'm going to invite a couple of our regional mentors to the stage. So Kevin Wang, right here. He's a co-founder of and executive director of the Hua Foundation. He also just came here from a Hong Kong protest, and he engages the Chinese-Canadian community, especially on sustainability, including food systems. Yeah. Kevin.
Thanks for having me. Good evening, everybody. Yes, I did just come from that, so excuse me for reading off my phone because I was writing it back there just now. My name is Kevin Hua. I'm one of the co-founders and current executive director of an organization called Hua Foundation. Our projects in the past 10 years have ranged from consumer-based shark conservation strategies under a project called Shark Truth to the Choi project, where we're looking into how we can bring more local and sustainable foods onto a Chinese dinner table. The Choi project is still ongoing as we embark on the new project called Race and Equity, where we're looking at how race plays out and impacts systems and sectors such as the media. Come on, the past couple months has been pretty rough, right? Our democratic systems, workplaces, and social movements such as the environment. So on the environmental front, the Black, Indigenous, and people of color continues to be disproportionately impacted by the climate emergency. So even for me as an executive director, it's kind of hard for me to succinctly describe what we do as an organization because we've always been balancing the push for advocacy and systems change while responding to the needs and emerging issues within our own community. And I'm definitely way into responding to community needs right now. That's why I'm wearing a face mask, because I'm showing solidarity with Hong Kong, where as of 2 days ago, the pro-Beijing government enacted a colonial-era emergency regular ordinance to pass this anti-mask ban without a vote through their legislature. This means that people in Hong Kong cannot show up to protest wearing a mask to protect their identity. And note that this is an era of political terror where political dissidents through state surveillance have arrested over 2,500 people to date. This is all within the past 18 weeks. And one day, one of the biggest mass rallies actually had 2 million people show up to try and repeal the extradition law. So sit with that. 2 million, which is 25% of Hong Kong's population showing up for something they believe in. And yet, going into the 18th week as of tomorrow, nothing has changed. And the police brutality and crackdown continues. So I think that as it really breaks my heart to see that the front lines of social movements, including the climate, including what we're seeing in Hong Kong, is led by young people. So I believe that we have to talk about governments as a society structure, and how we can think about governments as ways to make them strengthen the governments to serve us even more. So while we're seeing the rapid erosion of Hong Kong democracy in Hong Kong, we should also look into how to further strengthen our own democracy here. So I would say by lowering the voting age, instituting a proportional representation to replace first past the post, our individual voice matters. Our individual actions matter. Let's make sure that we have systems and structures where voices and actions actually count. So for the climate, for a stronger democracy, and for Hong Kong, who wants a future where they have freedoms and democracy? Thank you.
Thanks, Kevin. Thank you. And now it's my pleasure to bring up Maurice Bergeron, who's the founder of Eat the Dishes, and she's going to tell us about her Lighter Living initiative.
So who else's eco-anxiety is through the roof right now? Mine certainly is. So I'm Maurice Bergeron. I'm the founder of Eat the Dishes, as you can see right there. We are Vancouver's first zero-waste, plant-based street food. So basically, a little tiny background about me. I was working for the aviation industry, one of the most wasteful industries for the last 8 years prior to launching this. I lived in Dubai. I flew to all 5 continents. I enjoyed street food tremendously in all 5, and unfortunately, I saw a common theme amongst each continent. That was waste. So every time I would buy something from a food vendor, they'd give it to me in styrofoam, plastic, etc. And so I knew that something had to change. I looked within myself. I realized my lifestyle was not aligning to what I wanted to do. And I thought I could do something within the street food industry to really shift it. So basically, I moved back to Vancouver. I launched Eat the Dishes. You can eat the entire dish, even the napkin that we give you, because we didn't want to give any single-use items. Even the napkin, we use upcycled fabric, and we make our own napkins to give to the consumer, and also to encourage people to reuse rather than just throw out 5 minutes after they've eaten their meal. We also tackle food waste, so we buy bumped and bruised produce, ugly produce that people don't normally buy. Normally that ends up in the landfill, and we turn it into soups. And then I really, really think that sustainability, like some of the speakers have mentioned, it starts on your plate. So that's why we're 100% vegan as well. One single burger is equivalent to 660 gallons of water being used. So that's why I really encourage everybody, if you want resources, to shift towards a vegan diet. And so reach out to me if you'd like some recipes, etc. Thanks very much.
Thank you. And so we have 2 other regional actors. Patrick Nangal, you are the CEO of Modo, which is an alternative to car ownership, and it's for car sharing, and it's a cooperative model. So could you tell us a little more about it, Patrick?
Yes, with pleasure, and thank you, Vanessa, for the opportunity, and good evening, everybody. So I choose to be an optimist. I wanted to start with that. I make a difference. I tried to make a difference in my personal life, but I wanted to make an impact at scale, and that's why I joined Modo Cooperative almost exactly 3 years ago. So what is Modo? In case anybody doesn't know, we're a cooperative, one member, one vote, that provides car sharing. 20,000 plus members, 700 cars. It is sharing economy in the truest sense of that expression. I know the term has been co-opted by quite a number of other players out there in the market. So these individuals co-own these cars, and we provide a platform that allows them to take turns using them and pay their fair share of the cost. We do that in a way that we try to be as affordable as possible. I like to characterize us as a not for loss. So we're working just to keep our nose above water and keep the prices and the costs as low as possible. Are we in the car rental business? No. We advocate to our members, walk, ride your bike, use transit as first choices. If you must use a car, and sometimes people want to use a vehicle, use a shared vehicle. And so we make quite a wide variety of vehicles available, cargo vans and pickup trucks and small cars and passenger vans and regular sedans. The idea being match the vehicle to the purpose of the trip. So when you need a car, use a shared car. There are today 3,000 shared cars in Metro Vancouver and close surrounding, 3,000 shared cars. Those shared cars have roughly replaced on a 1 to 10 basis privately owned vehicles. So 3,000 cars replaced 30,000 vehicles. We're kind of have a reputation as being the car sharing capital of North America and pretty highly ranked in the world. Frankly, that doesn't matter a hill of beans to me. We have a population in Metro Vancouver of 2.5 million people. There are 1.6 million privately owned vehicles. So 2 cars for every 3 people. So think about 1.6 million cars compared to 30,000, right? Drop in the bucket. Vancouver's a wonderful place to live. We're expecting another 1 million people here over the course of the next 2 decades. If they bring cars in the same ratio, that's another 600,000 or 700,000 cars that are going to hit our streets. You know, if you think we have gridlock today, you haven't seen anything yet. So we're trying to make a difference. We think this is a really interesting approach. We work on things like transitioning the fleet as fast as we can to zero-emission vehicles. We just invested into hydrogen fuel cell vehicles. We're moving the fleet to battery electric and plug-in hybrid. We can't do it alone. We partner with people like Transit. Transit is the juice to make shared mobility work and a lighter living approach around transportation. We work with all the municipalities. Could go faster, frankly, but there's a lot that we can't do it by ourselves. Partnership is really important to us. The last thing I'll mention around partnership, 2 things. One, we have a pilot in place with TransLink and UBC, which has created something brand new. It's a hybrid between carpooling and car sharing, which is very cool. It's in pilot right now. And we have another mobility platform in development that's a partnership with TransLink and Evo and Mobi and Modo that will create something around shared mobility that we think will be really helpful. Thank you.
Great. And Irina McKenzie from FabCycle. So you're the founder of FabCycle, but you're also the founder and executive director of Frameworks, so education societies. So could you tell us about those?
Absolutely. Thank you, Vanessa. Hi, everybody. Thank you for being here. So my name is Irina, and in the keyword, it's textile waste. That's my realm of work. So I have 2 projects. I'm the founder of Framework Education Society, and we operate community repair events all over Metro Vancouver and outside. The way it works is that we bring sewing machines, sewing supplies to libraries, community centers, and everywhere where there's community, and we invite participants to bring their clothes to repair. So our mission is essentially to overthrow a throwaway culture, build resilient communities, bring repair skills back to life, and of course divert textile waste from the landfill. Next time you have anything to darn, to repair, please get in touch. We have Fix-Its coming up all the time. Today we had enrichment, we have Vancouver, UBC, Abbey, and so on. The other thing is that we work a lot with industry. So FabCycle is also my business, and it's a collection service for textile waste. And we chose to work with one of the hardest textile waste streams there are, fabric scraps. Nobody really wants to work with, not clothing. And so we work directly with factories, fashion designers, schools to collect their fabric waste and to reuse or recycle their waste. We have a textile waste reuse center. particularly emphasis on the reuse word, not far from here in Chinatown, where we bring everything that is reusable, and we serve as matchmakers, essentially, between what we have, that is some beautiful fabrics, scraps, notions, and to the creative community that can actually reuse it. And they also serve as the ambassadors to what actually exists as waste as a resource. And so please, if you know any creatives, any crafters, hobbyists, anybody that really understands how much textile and fabric is beautiful and valuable, get in touch. And please remember me, textile waste, anything related, I would love to connect and talk to more people about that, and repairs too. Thank you.
Thank you.
Here in the region, we have a great opportunity. As you've heard earlier in the evening, we have some incredibly innovative initiatives happening right here. And we have some really great thinkers who are saying, okay, this is what the numbers are telling us. This is what's effective. We have places like Vancity that are letting our money grow, our places grow in a really meaningful way. And so what can we do as a region? And so this is, Vancity and One Earth are partnering together on the Lighter Living Initiative. The City of Vancouver has put us the challenge saying, what do we do in light of the climate emergency? And the regional government and others are asking the same question. So this region has an opportunity to really become something that other places can also look to in this transition. And this means that we need to move away from this being the job of environmentalists or of a few people to becoming everybody's conversation. A colleague of ours said, Alex Steffen, who's a futurist, he said, climate change is not an issue. So it's not an issue like a political issue for the election. It's actually the era that we live in right now. This climate emergency is the era that we live in. So how do we all support a conversation among the people that we're with in order to do that? And so with the Lighter Living Partnership, we're going to try to make that a lot easier for all of us to do and to build into. So we'll share some of the best things that we know of. You saw probably the slide deck when you first came in. Those are 40 of the initiatives that are happening here in the region, but we want to be highlighting many, many more. We know thousands that are happening here in the region that are really exciting. So please join us on that journey, and also connect with others who are taking those kinds of questions forward. Like Rosemary said, there's great Facebook groups right now, like Zero Waste Facebook. City Hive is bringing young people together to say, how do we solve the lighter living challenges? What kind of innovative solutions can we bring to it? Contribute to municipal planning. Bring your ideas forward, but also know that there's a whole community here we're really wanting to support how we can actually play our best game in terms of really trying to match the scale and urgency of the challenge. So with that, thank you so much also, Amanda, for co-facilitating this engagement piece, because these green slips of paper and any other pieces of paper you want to leave here are an input to both of those initiatives, which are really a gift to all of us. So we're going to scan them, share them back with you, but also they'll inform these processes. So please, if you need an extra index card and you want to write some other idea that's occurred to you that doesn't neatly fit in here, please do add it. And also, I'd just like to thank Stina, who has been doing some amazing work here to capture this discussion and the idea of the systemic change, this tidal wave that we're going. So you're welcome to take photos in front of it as well if you like later, or share your commitments there. And of course, to the co-conveners and to those who shared their initiatives with us tonight. So thank you to all of you for co-hosting this space. There were others who wished to be here too, so we'll definitely share the video back with them. And moreover, this is a regional conversation that is totally happening right now, and we're really looking forward to continuing work together. Yeah, Vanessa.
So just a final note to say thanks to everyone for being here, and particularly look forward to joining our hands together, as Jennie was saying, as we move towards lighter living. Have a great night.